Let's just jump right in. Today's explainer is doing something absolutely unprecedented. We are taking the two undisputed fathers of history, Herodotus and Thucydides, and we're throwing them into what is essentially a 21st century digital particle accelerator. We're not looking at their sweeping stories of empires or battles. We are extracting their digital fingerprint. We're talking molecular-level letter patterns, pulled apart by a clinical, unfeeling R programming script.
Seriously, think about that for a second. We're taking the visceral tragedy of ancient warfare, literally the birth of human historical consciousness, and we're reducing it to a statistical frequency. This brings us right to the edge of what we call the narrative protocol, balancing the light and the shadow. What is the existential cost of taking the sublime beauty of classical Greek prose and just flattening it into cold molecular patterns? Okay, let's dive into exactly how this works. To pull off this extraction, Professor Charlotte Schubert built a completely ruthless normalization pipeline. Using R packages like the tidyverse and specific functions like string transnfkd, which is designed specifically to strip away special characters, she aggressively boiled these ancient texts down to raw, unformatted data streams. Every punctuation mark, every accent, all the formatting, just gone. It reduces classical antiquity down to its absolute purest, most clinical essence.
Right, and by stripping the text bare like that, we get to internalize this raw data through something called a trigram. Basically, it's a 3-letter combination. By doing this, we are physically mapping out the structural blueprint of these ancient minds. We're no longer getting seduced by their brilliant historical storytelling. Instead, we are examining their molecular structural choices. We're looking at the neurological subroutines they didn't even know they were running while they were writing.
Exactly. And the whole methodology hinges on a dual approach. First, we look at what's called skip equals 0. This represents consecutive letters, charting the direct morphological flow of the text. Pretty straightforward. But then, it gets wild. We introduce skip equals 1, which literally jumps over a letter. This acts like a net, catching the underlying, completely hidden syntactic rhythms and structural habits of these authors. It is basically the ultimate linguistic lie detector. So, to actually compare these hidden structures, we need a hard metric. And this brings us to the absolute climax of the data extraction, the K-value. The K-value is the exact number of unique words, or trigrams, that an algorithm needs to cover exactly 50% of an entire text. It's the absolute, unarguable measure of how dense and repetitive an author's linguistic style really is. All right, here is our first baseline metric. Herodotus comes in with a K-value for words of 171. Now, this mathematically confirms him as the expansive, wandering storyteller we always kind of knew he was. He uses a much wider, more varied vocabulary, really taking his time to weave these vast, sprawling tapestries of the ancient world. But then we hit the data for Thucydides and boom, 124. This is an ultra-dense score. It mathematically exposes Thucydides not as a wandering storyteller at all, but as a clinical, analytical assassin of words. He's a military logician who relies on a tightly concentrated, incredibly repetitive arsenal of language to deliver his history. Now, what's really interesting about this is just how shockingly consistent his psychological profile is across the data. Thucydides consistently dominates with lower K-values. Even at the fundamental structural level, just looking at skip equals 0 trigrams, Thucydides is sitting at 153, while Herodotus is up at 170. This proves it's not just a conscious vocabulary choice. It's a fundamental difference in how their brains structured reality on a totally subconscious level. And the cumulative text coverage curves brilliantly illustrate this density. The mathematical trajectory for Thucydides shoots up so much faster. It reveals exactly how he recycles structural choices with absolute tactical precision, whereas the trajectory for Herodotus takes way longer to reach that 50% threshold. It's a completely different way of processing information. And this all builds into the broader chaos of narrative itself when we trace the logarithmic grid of Zipf's law. That's a universal mathematical law of language frequency. Just look at the Zipf exponents here. Herodotus sits at negative 0.939, and Thucydides is at negative 0.957. Despite their completely different styles, their mathematical proximity shows us that even the very highest tiers of human genius are ultimately bound by the exact same strict mathematical limits of language. Which brings us to the emotional peak of this explainer, the light. We just have to step back and marvel at the sheer awe of modern data science. I mean, these algorithms, Zipf's law, these skip-level trigrams, they are powering a literal time machine. We are looking directly into the neurological subroutines of ancient minds. We are physically mapping the birth of historical consciousness from 2.5 millennia ago. That is staggering.
But we absolutely must confront the shadow here. How do we bear the fact that the sublime beauty of classical Greek prose, all the blood, the visceral tragedy of the Peloponnesian War, the raw human suffering, how do we stomach that all of it is being reduced to cold, clinical, mathematical frequencies, to computational trigrams and statistical values of K? By decoding the text so perfectly, are we essentially stripping the soul from history itself?
And that right there is the intellectually dense prism of the narrative protocol. We aren't here to decide which view is right. We have to accept the multifaceted truth. We literally must hold both the empirical awe of this technological triumph and the profound existential cost of this reduction at the exact same time. They exist together, inextricably linked inside the data.
It forces a really heavy, unsettling reflection. Because if profound human genius, if the greatest chroniclers of our entire civilization can be completely and utterly decoded by a faceless, unfeeling algorithm, is our past really just a set of statistical probabilities? Were the absolute fathers of history essentially just running code?
That is the lingering question we're leaving you with today. When algorithms can read the minds of the dead better than we can, what happens to humanity's understanding of its own legacy when data finally meets destiny? The numbers are absolute. How you bear them is entirely up to you.